And then 4 years ago, we visited another refugee camp called Jenin. Now, Jenin is a unique Palestinian refugee camp. 1 square mile, 10,000 families, 50 years. A rancid, rat-infested set of hovels. It's unique because the refugees could climb up onto the roofs of the refugee camp and they could actually see the shining city of Haifa and their own houses. Because every one of those refugees comes from the Haifa they can see from the roofs of the refugee camp on which they have subsisted for 50 years. They can see their own houses, their own gardens, their own orange trees, their own fruit being picked by people who came from Brooklyn and Paris and London and all over the world, who claimed that God, the estate agent, promised this land to them. Can you imagine what it would be like to be in a refugee camp and be able to see your own house being lived in by someone else? But not content with that torture for half a century, 4 years ago, Sharon's army poured into that refugee camp, just like they did in Sabra and Shatila, and began massacring the Palestinian inhabitants. And Ron and I were there within 2 days of the fall of the camp. It was still smoldering. You could still smell the dead people who were still lying unburied underneath the crushed masonry. So horrific was this massacre that on a Saturday night, the Security Council gathered in New York and passed a resolution, this time not vetoed by the United States. So horrific was the massacre, demanding that Israel allow inspectors to go into the camp to check reports of mass destruction amongst the refugees. Sharon answered on the Sunday morning, there will be no United Nations inspectors entering Israel or entering the camp in Jenin. He told them to get stuffed. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. The United Nations Security Council, which on the Saturday night had augustly passed this demand, by Sunday night had packed their suitcases and gone home and said nothing more about it. Now, most people in the United States and the United Kingdom don't know or care much about that. But every Muslim in the world knows and cares about that. It's another of the reasons why the swamp gets deeper and deeper. And out of that swamp comes the mutation of terrorism that we saw on 9/11 and on other occasions. Let's be clear about something. Osama bin Laden has nothing to do with us. Osama bin Laden was invented, armed, financed, and sent to Afghanistan by the United States of America and Great Britain and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Turkey. We won't allow any rewriting of history about this. If you'll permit me to quote myself, on the night before the fall of Kabul, to bin Laden and the Mujahideen, so-called, the fathers of the Taliban, I said to Mrs. Thatcher, though I was the last man standing in the British Parliament saying this, and that wasn't the last time that was to happen, I said to Mrs. Thatcher, in the British Parliament, you have opened the gates for the barbarians. And a long dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan. And I never said a truer word. We have to tell the Medveds of the world, whether they want to hear it or not, over and over again, don't try and hang Osama bin Laden round our neck. he was your man. And he went to Afghanistan to do your dirty work, which is one of the many reasons why we say that the attack on Afghanistan after 9/11 was doubly unjust. There were no Afghans on those airplanes that struck the United States. No Afghan ever hurt any American. Most of the Afghans who have been slaughtered since 9/11 don't even know where the United States is. Never heard of Seattle, Washington. Don't know about Boeing and its plant and its anti-union practices. The poorest, most ragged people on the earth were bombarded by the most powerful and richest people on earth. As I said that day when the House of Commons was recalled 4 days after 9/11, I despise Osama bin Laden. The difference is I've always despised Osama bin Laden. I despised him when you were giving him guns and money and support and telling him what he should be doing. It's because I want to negotiate not with bin Laden or bin Ladenism. I want to negotiate with those who haven't joined him yet. I want to negotiate with those who might join him tomorrow if we don't drain that swamp of the grievances which are feeding this phenomenon of Islamist, fundamentalist, obscurantist terror. The second reason, the second main reason why this swamp exists is our policy, your policy, of propping up every puppet president and corrupt king who rules the Muslim world almost without exception from one end to the other. You know, you have to laugh. They say they invaded Iraq so that they could have democracy. Next door to Iraq is a country called Saudi Arabia. You may have seen the death of the tyrant, King Fahd. Why did they all descend on Saudi Arabia to mourn the passing of this tyrant, apart from their own personal business interests? Because the thief they were burying sent almost all of the money he stole here. He turned his country into a private bank and looted it systematically, spending the money in the casinos, in the bordellos, in the arms bazaars, and in the banks and stock exchanges of the West. Saudi Arabia has $6 trillion in the American banks and the American stock market. Which means, of course, that they don't have it at all. Because if they ever dreamt of withdrawing their $6 trillion, it would have to be compensated and confiscated rather overnight, because it would occasion the collapse of the United States economy if $6 trillion were withdrawn. So in fact, the thief, Fahd, didn't just steal the money from his country, he actually gave it away, effectively, to the United States of America in exchange for the military, political, and diplomatic support to allow him to stay in power. And when the Western leaders arrived for the funeral, it wasn't just to bury the tyrant, it was to kiss the nose as a prelude to kissing somewhere else of the tyrant who replaced him, in the hope that they could continue business as usual with that tyrant. Now, I'm laboring that point for this reason. What do you think the people of Saudi Arabia think when they hear Bush and Blair talking about freedom and democracy and liberty, when they see all these Western leaders on their knees in front of the tyrants who rule them? What do you think they think in the Arab world about the idea of you wanting democracy in their region when you are in the pockets of such a tyrannical set of thieves.